Hello, and welcome to the state of the Medomak. We are Midcoast Conservancy. We protect and restore vital lands and waters on a scale that matters. We divide our work into three different pillars: land, water, and community. To date, we've conserved over 15,500 acres. This is across three different watersheds: the Sheepskit River, the Damariscotta Lake, and the Medomak River. 7,000 of these acres are in conservation easements, so that's land that's privately held, but we own the developmental rights to it, and 8,500 acres in fee, so owned by Midcoast Conservancy. We also have 25 different hiking preserves with a total of over 95 miles of recreational trails. All right, so welcome to the state of the Medomak. This is the first state of the Medomak. This is part of our State of the Midcoast series. We had the state of the Damariscotta Lake a couple weeks ago, and we have the state of the Medomak, or state of the Sheepskit, in a couple weeks. This is a state of the Medomak. I'm going to go through the Medomak watershed, so what a watershed is and what makes our watershed so special. Then I'm going to give a little, very brief, little natural history section. This is because I think it's really important to know where we've been, to know why we're at where we are today, and where we need to go in the future. I'm going to talk about some threats to our watershed. When I say threats, I feel like that can sound very doom and gloomy. And also then there's the questions, threats from what and threats to what. So I'm going to be talking about threats to the diversity and connectivity of our watershed, so both ecologically and within the human community. I'm going to focus on some land conservation and water quality work we do here in the Medomak, and then we're going to talk about how you guys can help support the watershed. So a little bit about me. My name is Morgan. I'm the Medomak Regional Stewardship Manager here at Midcoast Conservancy. I grew up right here in Waldoboro on the Goose River. I've always loved exploring the woods and rivers around here and working the land, and grew up farming. Grew up here, went to college, moved out west, had some fun out there. And then in 2021, I moved back home and started with Midcoast Conservancy in 2022. This really is my dream job. I absolutely feel so lucky to be able to use my experiences from away combined with my local connections to help serve this amazing community and all of you guys. So why does this matter? Why are we all here today? One of the reasons: we all live in a watershed. And a healthy watershed is a healthy ecosystem, and healthy ecosystems result in healthy communities. We also have a lot of farmland and working waterfront here in the Medomak, so a lot of food and natural resources are produced here. And our watershed is pretty healthy, so we want to keep it this way and keep those resources for people in the future. A question that I get asked a lot is, what is a watershed? And this is a really great question. So a watershed is the area of land that channels rainfall or snow melt off into a single point. And so that single point that we're talking about today is the Medomak River. And every little stream that's in that area contributes to the quality and quantity of the water downstream. So anything that your neighbor's doing upstream affects you, and anything you're doing affects people downstream. So hopefully after this presentation, you understand the role of the watershed in our lives and our role in its life. And yeah, how we can work together to protect these resources for future generations. The Medomak River, so the Medomak Valley, Medomak watershed, those are watershed and valley are interchangeable. Medomak is Wabanaki for place of many alewives. And it runs for 13 towns, starts up in Searsmont, Liberty area, runs for about 30 miles, and then here in Waldoboro where it hits the ocean and runs for about 9 miles of estuary. So a little bit of the anatomy of a watershed is it starts at the headwaters. So this is where the Medomak starts. So Searsmont, Liberty, and Appleton. We can think of those places being a little bit far away, but everything that they do up there affects us down here in Waldoboro. So Fishbrook and Pettingill Stream start up there. And another area that the Medomak starts in is Washington Pond in Washington, and the Little Medomak flows out of there. So you have Fishbrook, Pettingill Stream, and the Little Medomak all coming together to merge into the main stem. So the main stem flows for about 30 miles through Washington, Union, and Waldoboro, and as more you move downstream, it gets bigger as more and more water is being inputted into the system. Then it flows here to the head of tide. The head of tide is the furthest upstream that there's ocean influence, or there's tidal influence, tidal activity. And so here in Waldoboro, it's right down the bridge across on Main Street. So if you go over that bridge and look to the right, you'll see these falls. And the Medomac's pretty cool with the head of tide because it's unique. We have a very stark head of tide. So certain rivers, the head of tide will change depending on the time of day or tide or year. But here in Waldoboro, the high tide rarely ever goes above those falls. So it's pretty much always where the head of tide is. Then we move into the estuary. So then you go from the head of tide. The estuary here ends a little bit past the Narrows, which is depicted as this a little bit below this black or above the black line here. Um, and it's where you have mixing from river water and ocean water, and a lot of tidal activity. Estuaries are really important. They're good habitat and nurseries for a lot of our harvested species, and because they are both freshwater and saltwater mixing, they're really important pathways for migrating fish like alewives and eel to help them acclimate from going from their freshwater stage to their saltwater stage or vice versa. So a lot of our creatures, we have lobsters, clams, elvers, rockweed, oysters, seaweeds, all grow here in the estuary or rely on the estuary for their life cycle, part of their life cycle. So very important to us. And then we go out into the open ocean. So now we know a little bit about what a watershed is and what makes the Medomak so special. I'm going to talk about how it was created and how we got here today. So around 13,000 years ago, the Laurentine Glacier covered Maine. Parts of it were a mile to 2 miles thick. And how a glacier works is it's just a big sheet of ice and they move across the landscape. So you could picture a little ice cube. If it was on a slanted surface, it would slowly slip down. So that's what the glacier is doing. And so as the glacier is moving across the landscape, it's carving out the earth, picking up mineral deposits and material and debris and carrying them with them. Then around 12,000 years ago, the climate started to change, started to warm up, and the glaciers receded. As they recede and melt, they then leave behind all of that material that they picked up as they were moving across the landscape. This has resulted in this area to a lot of ledges and ridges, valleys, mineral deposits, as well as glacial erratics. A glacial erratic is, if you've ever been out in the woods, and you see this giant rock in the middle of nowhere. You're like, how did that get there? The answer is usually a glacier, hitched a ride on a glacier. For most of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the lower watershed, so the estuary portion, and in future years, we'll focus on different aspects of the watershed. There's a lot to it. So around 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers started to recede, people started moving here. Some of the first people here were the Wawanok. They were a band of the Penobscot tribe, and the Penobscot tribe then formed with other tribes to form the Wabanaki Confederacy, who are still on our landscape today. And Wabanaki means people of the Dawnland. So they had settlements along the coast, and they had really well-established walking routes. These walking routes followed these ridges that were away from the water's edge that were created by the glaciers. They relied on wildlife, forestry products, farming, and fishing to get by. And they mostly hung out in the estuary during the spring and summer months. In the 1600s, the Europeans started to arrive, and with that, they brought disease. Unfortunately, sadly, about 75% to 90% of the native population in this region died off due to disease brought by the Europeans. And so, between war and disease, a lot of the natives were pushed out and the European settlers came in, and they settled on the old Wawanok settlements. The natives had already developed these really great spots along the water, and they had these really amazing walking routes up along the ridge. We know these walking routes today as Route 1, Route 32, Route 22, Dutch Neck, Back Cove, and etc. The European settlers, they also relied on wildlife, forestry products, farming, fishing, and also quarries and the reason we have so many quarries around here is from the mineral deposits of those glaciers. As they built and farmed the land, They cleared a lot of trees. Here's a picture from the late 1800s. You can see pretty much no trees. They say there wasn't a tree from here to Augusta. They also built their houses along the roadways, which the roadways were along the ridges away from the river. This just made sense back then. If you were a farmer, you didn't want to put in a driveway that would use up valuable farming land, also that it would take longer to get to the road. And so what does this mean what does all of this history and land use history mean for us today? That it's created an estuary with a pretty intact shoreline. This is really important for erosion control, habitat connectivity, good for fish habitat and water quality. So one of the best ways to protect or help water quality is to protect the land and conserve the land around there. So land conservation is something that's really important to us here at Midcoast Conservancy. Like I said, conserving land helps protect water quality. It also allows for healthy ecosystems. The more area and the more diverse an area is, allows for more wildlife to live there and spaces for that wildlife to move. So how wildlife will get from one habitat type to another or one habitat block to another, it was called wildlife corridors. So you can think of Route 1 and Route 22 as like us, our human corridors. So the wildlife also have corridors. This is being, these healthy ecosystems and wildlife corridors are being threatened by development. And while not all development is bad, unplanned and uncontrolled development can be a big problem. And so this is a quote from someone who moved here from Connecticut. I've seen what unplanned development can do to rural communities, how it changes the ecology of a place, forcing wildlife to eke out a living in a fragmented landscape, move elsewhere, or perish. And how do we know that this is happening? Well, if any of you guys have been here in the past 5 years, you might have noticed that a lot of properties are going up for sale. And they are. So the data shows that in the last decade, from the first 4 years of the last decade, only 58 properties sold. Meanwhile, in the past, from 2020 to 2023, 187 properties sold. And these properties are only undeveloped land. These are not house lots. These are just lots of land. And not only are more lots of land being sold off, but the cost of those lots of land are increasing. So from 2017 to 2024, there was a 300% increase in cost to conserve a parcel of land. You can see this on this graph. This shows from 2017 to 2024 the increase. So 2024 is on the left, 80,000 was the average price for land. So with all of these pressures being put on our landscape and on our habitat blocks, how do we know what areas are important to conserve? We've done a lot of data analytics to identify these core habitat blocks, and one of them around here is the Three Brooks Wilderness. This is that area as you're driving down 220 South and you look to the left, all of that woodlands until you get to Finntown Road is the Three Brooks area. It's around 6,000 acres of intact wilderness, and it's one of the largest intact wilderness blocks from Kittery to Belfast. So pretty important to save. And so not only is all this land conservation work good for water quality and important for wildlife, it's also really important for our human communities. And so to date, we've conserved over 5,000 acres in the Medomak Valley. That's through conservation easements as well as land that we own. And we have 11 hiking preserves. Those go over both easements and public land that we own, with a total of over 13 miles of trails throughout the region. Over 2,000 of those acres are owned by us and therefore open to you as the public. This provides hunting, fishing, and foraging opportunities for people, which is how a lot of people around here feed their families and put food on the table for the winter, as well as recreation opportunities. Being outside is really good for our mental health and just building good communities. We partner with the Waldoboro Snow Crawlers, the snowmobile club. They have another amazing trail system that also runs through private and public lands. In order to care for all these lands that we have, one thing we do is invasive species management. So one threat to our forest right now is the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's this small insect from East Asia. It was first found in Maine in the early 2000s, and currently it's only along the coast. It hasn't really moved inland. We used to have some pretty cold winters here in Maine, and that helped keep the adelgid population down. But as we're having warmer winters, their populations are able to increase. The way they work is they attach to the base of a needle of a tree and suck the sap out of the tree, so literally sucking the life out of the tree. And this can take between 5 to 20 years to kill a tree, so it's kind of slow. And it appears as white fuzz on the underside of the hemlock branches. But the good news is there is hope. There's the ST beetle, and they prey on the hemlock woolly adelgid. And so we've been able to work with the town of Waldoboro because the town of Waldoboro has an old growth hemlock stand in the town forest. It's very, very important. Some of the trees in there are over 250 years old, and they were infected with the adelgid. So Midcoast Conservancy and the town of Waldoboro have worked together to write grants to be able to purchase these beetles and release them in the town forest and other properties um, in the Medomak Valley. So we're able to release 5,000 total in the Medomak Valley, and then at the town forest, so there's been a lot of work done already there. And in the trailhead near Route 1, there's very little adelgid there now because of all the work that's been done. Unfortunately, further in on the trail, the adelgid population is doing pretty well. So we were able to release 1,600 beetles there this a couple months ago to help control that population. So now I'm going to move on. So we've gone through our natural history and some of our land conservation work. Now I'm going to talk to some of the water quality work that we do. And so another threat to our area, to our watershed, is the Gulf of Maine is warming. It's actually warming faster than any other ocean on the planet. This can be, so the Medomak flows into Muscongas Bay. Muscongas Bay then flows into the Gulf of Maine, and the Gulf of Maine then goes into the Atlantic Ocean. This graph here on the right shows this warming trend. So the orange line represents the average ocean temperature, and the dark blue line is the Gulf of Maine. So the further below that orange line, that means that the temperatures were below average, globally, the global average. And as that blue line, so 1980, 1990 was pretty far, it was below the line. But you can see as we move into the 2010s and the 2020s, there's been a pretty steep rate of change, and now it's above that average ocean temperature. 2021 was the warmest recorded year in the Gulf of Maine since the 80s, and just last year, the months of February, March, and April were the warmest recorded months in the area. So what are we doing to help monitor these changes? We are part of the Maine Coastal Observing Alliance called MCOA. It was formed in 2014 when some local conservation folks noticed some concerning trends in their waters and wondered how their estuary compared to other ones nearby. They created this great collaboration between conservation organizations, municipalities, community members, state agencies, and university professors, all working together to collect data from Casco Bay to Belfast. So not only do we have data for a long period of time, 10 years now, but also over a large area of the Maine coast. At each site, we collect water quality data, total nitrogen, dissolved oxygen, pH, temperature, and salinity. So what's happening here in our Medomak River? On the left, you have our sites that we sample at. So we start right here by Pine Street Landing, a little bit downstream from there. Then we go up Hollis Point, Jones Neck, Martins Point, and then Jones Garden. So what you can see is happening, this graph here shows the average August temperatures for 1 meter below the surface for from 2014 to 2023. So you can see the upper estuary is usually a little bit warmer, the lower estuary is a little bit colder, and from 2014 to about 2019, they follow the same trend. So they kind of stay the same. There's some warm years in 2017, 2018, cooler years in 2019. But then since 2020, what you can see is the upper estuary is kind of either staying the same, maybe a little bit cooler, but this lower estuary, which has a lot more ocean influence, and as we talked about, the Gulf of Maine is warming, so there's becoming more warmer water influence. This rate of change is increasing pretty significantly. So we'll just need to collect more data and watch this trend. But it does affect our estuary. It affects it in a lot of ways, but two of these ways that I'm going to talk about today are the green crabs and eelgrass. So green crabs are invasive species that came here in the 1900s. They're really problematic because they prey on soft-shell clams, which is obviously an issue here in the Medomak as we're one of the state's largest clam producers. And they destroy eelgrass beds, which I'll get to in a second as to why that's a problem. Much like the adelgid, our cold winters used to keep their numbers in check, but as we're having warmer and warmer winters, their populations are increasing. And they're a really tricky species to manage. There's not a lot of commercial interest in them, so not a lot of people want to go harvest them. But a lot of people are working on this issue, just nobody's quite cracked the code just yet. So then we have our eelgrass. Just like we have fields here up on land, there's fields of eelgrass down on the ocean floor and the estuary floor. It's a really important habitat as it's part of the food chain and provides shelter for juvenile fish and invertebrates like the clams and lobsters. So not only are the green crabs killing the clams, they're also destroying the habitat that clams need to live and survive as part of their life cycle. These eelgrass beds also help stabilize sediments and shorelines, which is really important as we're getting more frequent storms, and the storms we're getting are more severe in intensity. And the distribution and size of eelgrass beds is changing. And this is due, we think, to warming waters and green crab predation. To find out what's happening with the eelgrass beds, Midcoast Conservancy was able to partner and help out the Maine DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, to help map the current eelgrass beds. We were able to give them some of our water clarity data to help calibrate their aerial surveys, as well as connect them with local volunteer captains to help conduct these surveys. So this is Cheyenne Adams of the DEP and me. We were out there last summer. We had this little camera. We would put it over the back of the boat and tow it behind us. And it would record the ocean floor so we could see where the eelgrass was and how healthy and what state it was in. So for all of this, we've learned about the history, where we are now, where we came from, and where do we need to go. So what is the state of the Medomak? Right now, pretty good. We have a lot of healthy waters and intact wilderness blocks. But this isn't by accident. This is due to a lot of different people working together over the decades to help reduce pollution that goes into our river, to put in riparian buffer zones, to protect our wildlife, protect our lands. But the communities and climate are still changing, and we all need to work together to keep our watershed connected and diverse. One way that you can do that is by rewilding your lawn. So refrain from using spraying weed killers, fertilizers, or pesticides. You can also plant a riparian buffer, so vegetation along the shoreline. And this isn't just if you're in the estuary. This is if you're on a lake, a stream, a river, the ocean. This helps all waterways. And so that vegetation barrier helps prevent nutrient runoff as well as protecting against erosion. Another thing you can do is get your septic tanks pumped. So pump them every 3 to 5 years. Not only does this save you money by keeping your septic tank working, but it keeps pollution out of our waters. And speaking of our waters and how important they are, Liz Petruska is going to come up and talk to us about what you all can do to help support Midcoast Conservancy.